So welcome everyone, if you couldn't hear us before, to the Mental Health Commission of Canada's webinar series on mental health for first responders. My name is Carla Thorpe. I'm the Director of Prevention and Promotion Initiatives with the Mental Health Commission, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today to introduce this inaugural webinar, which is the first in a new series that we're launching that's going to focus on sharing information, resources, and strategies on mental health specifically for first responders. We've been really delighted with the response to the webinar series. We've got over 500 people that have registered for our session here today. Certainly there are a number of partners and stakeholders from across Canada that helped us in the lead up to this webinar. We'd like to acknowledge their contribution from a number of the Chiefs Association, including the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, the Paramedic Chiefs of Canada, and the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, as well as a number of member associations like the Canadian Police Association, the Paramedic Association of Canada, the International Association for Firefighters, and the Association of Public Safety Communications Officers. Also a number of different national associations like the Mood Disorder Society of Canada and the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention were very helpful in reaching out to some of their stakeholders as well. Certainly a number of other first responder advocate organizations like Temaconter Memorial Trust, Badge of Life Canada, the Great West Life Centre for Mental Health, and we'd also like to acknowledge the many health and safety associations and HR associations that partnered with us on promoting the webinar series as well from all across the country, but in particular Public Services Health and Safety Association in Ontario and also the BC Emergency Health Services. So it's my pleasure today to turn things over to my colleague Samuel Breaux, who will be moderating our session, and he's going to introduce the topic and speaker for today's webinar.
Thank you, Carla. Hello, everyone. My name is Samuel Breaux. I'm a Program Manager with Prevention and Promotion Initiatives here at the Commission. And just before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get going. And so I invite you to send any questions or comments using the chat feature, which can be found on the right of your screen. If you don't see the chat feature, look for the icon on the upper right-hand corner of your screen that says chat. It looks like a little bubble, and you can click on that, and then a chat window should appear for you on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint slides. We also encourage you, when you are sending your questions, if you could please use the drop-down menu and select all panelists. So the questions can go to myself as well as the presenter, and I will ask the questions on your behalf towards the end of the webinar session. Please note that the presenter will deliver their presentation and will monitor the questions during the presentation and create a list that we will use during the question and answer period. This webinar is also being recorded, and so it will be posted on the Commission's website in the webinar archive section in about 2 weeks' time. And while this webinar session is being delivered in English, we will plan to deliver webinar sessions en français shortly, and so please stay tuned as we will announce these shortly. Also, due to the large number of participants today, we have muted all your phone lines just to eliminate any background noise. And finally, during the discussion today, the presentation could trigger certain uncomfortable feelings and thoughts. So while we're coming together as a community of over 300 individuals across the country, you may be participating in this alone in your office or at home, or might not feel comfortable talking to your colleagues. And so with this in mind, the webinar sessions are designed to be safe and inclusive. If you feel that this conversation is leaving you unsettled, please reach out to a friend, family member, colleague, or peer supporter to debrief. And if you are in crisis, please call the nearest distress center. If it's an emergency, you can call 911 or go to your local emergency department. Should you have any specific safety concerns that should be addressed during the presentation, please feel free to write directly to the host, myself, and we will try to address those. And finally, I know I said finally once, but there's a second part that I'd like to mention is that towards the end of the webinar session, once you click to leave, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. And we would love to hear back, to hear your feedback, as this helps us align and ensure that we meet your needs. And so your feedback is really important, and we include all of your feedback into the things that we do. And so please take a few moments to fill the survey towards the end once you leave the webinar session. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to present you today's presenter, and the Mental Health Commission of Canada is delighted to have Tom Walker with us. Tom Walker has worked in the field of social services for 28 years. He's currently a human factors specialist with Orange, where his key responsibilities is providing therapeutic interventions for paramedics and staff, and is developing and implementing a peer support program and working towards a healthy workplace environment. He's a trainer consultant with the Crisis Trauma Resource Institute, and previously he's worked at the clinical supervisor of Nexus Youth Services and the Concurrent Disorders Program. He is a trained clinical traumatologist and certified compassion fatigue specialist, lead trainer consultant with the Canadian Traumatology Institute. Tom has a private practice where he also works with trauma, suicide prevention, intervention and post-section, addictions, and mental health counseling for adolescents, adults, and family. He also teaches in postgraduate programs for concurrent disorders at Seneca College and Humber College. He has worked director of business development and training with CTI, where he's trained people helping people, and took leadership roles with the Youth Workers Training Initiative and the Breaking the Cycle program. Tom will deliver his presentation, and will be our pleasure to facilitate a short question and answer period during the last 15 minutes of the webinar session. So I'll pass it over to you, Tom, and enjoy the presentation.
Hello? Can you folks hear me now?
We can hear you, Tom. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. So welcome. Glad to be here, and looking forward to this workshop. I'm trying to figure out the slides. I think, have you turned it over to me, sir?
Yes, we're passing it over to you, Tom.
Okay. So while we're waiting, again, Tom Walker, you're going to be able to see the slides in a moment, and here they are. And so what's, I think, important is that as we go today, now it says I'm the presenter. Okay. So as we go today, if anyone has any questions, again, send that information in. So this first slide is a really important element here. We have Viktor Frankl saying that which is to give light must endure burning. And I'm just going to invite us to take a look at losing the must and acknowledging that it could be a could, but it doesn't have to be a must. And so as we work through this stuff, I'm going to invite people to really put on their Teflon and start to look at how do we become more intentional so that we don't develop, further problems, social, mental health, and PTSD problems, and that we really be intentional after each of the calls and take care of ourselves. We'll talk more about that. I invite you to put on your Teflon. Sometimes these workshops can be pretty difficult, and they can get pretty intense as you sit and watch and maybe are not surrounded by people that you know. So put on your Teflon, and if, as Samuel said at the beginning, if there's anything that comes up, take care of yourself. Really be good to yourself. As first responders, you support people on a continuum from small situations to the worst day of their lives. You see the horrific things people do to people. You hear people's pain, their grief, and their trauma. You listen to their fears, and you listen to their rage, and sometimes take on their rage because it's being directed at you. You run towards chaos, the norms, if you could see me, I'm quoting, the norms, they run away. You accompany people in a time of change and mourning, and all the while you're expected to be rational, calm, hopeful, and compassionate. You have a hell of a job. So with that, I say thank you, and I think it's really important for you to acknowledge that this is your world, this is your job. And so in the whole premise of this, when we look at suicide prevention, what I really invite people to be aware of is pain is inevitable, right? We will suffer from that, but we also, suffering long-term is optional. Suffering is an optional piece, and so, you know, as we look at it, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And I want to talk a little bit about surfing today. People don't know who I am or what I'm about, and I remember the first time I was in a meeting 4 years ago at Orange. One of the medics looked at me and said, "What the F did Orange do hiring a social worker?" And it was like one of those questions of, oh wow, there's a question. And it was a good question, because what do I understand about first responders? And at that point, it was limited. Over the past 4 years, I've learned a lot. But what I was able to say to him is I can offer a different perspective. I also know a little bit about trauma. I grew up in poverty. I had to pop bottle collect in order to be able to eat as a kid. We lived in violence and chaos. I had a father who played Russian roulette with his kids. So know a little bit about PTSD, and grew up with addiction. By the time I was 16, I lived in what you'd call a drug house, a crack house. There was every kind of drug you could imagine in the house, and it was available. I lost my mom to cigarettes, my brother to cocaine and at the hands of the police. There's a inquest, and I represented my family at the inquest. If you ever Google Tommy Walker Boxer, it will show a little bit about that. And I had a dad who died from a little bit too much booze. So have a little bit of a knowledge about trauma and suicide. And if you want to think about suicide and suicidal ideation from a long-term perspective, everyone in my family had some suicidal ideation, if you think about it. My mom was told she might be able to survive if she can kick smoking. My brother similar, and my father, and all died as a result. So just some things to think about. My take on trauma is, as someone who lives with trauma, I argue that we have to take care of ourselves. We have to take care of our colleagues. And that means sort of moving past that type A personality theory that a lot of people offer and impose on people who are first responders. We do need to expect our organization to take care of us, but if with that type A personality that everyone theoretically is made of, who is a first responder, it's really hard for us to allow ourselves to open up. And so my invitation is, how do we do that? And how do we open up the dialogue? Because unless we begin to do that, we'll have, I'll have more of those phone calls where someone has a gun in their hand. And those are pretty stressful calls. And it's sad that it takes a person that long before they can actually reach out for help. And so we need to be proactive, each and everyone on this call, and not stigmatize the bravery of asking for help, and sort of stepping out and asking for help if we need it. Otherwise, it may not come until it's too late. We cannot become what we want to be by remaining what we are. Love that expression. And so my invitation is that, you know, going forward after you listen to this, is there anything that you need to do, to think about, to do differently when you think about trauma and suicide? Is there anything that needs to happen so in how you take care of yourself, in how you connect with people, and how you support your colleagues? Is there anything? Today we're going to discuss the prevalence of suicide among first responders. We'll discuss factors leading up to suicide. We'll discuss PTSD and its connection to suicide. We'll take a look at prevention, intervention, and postvention, and we'll learn a little bit about surfing. How do we do that? What are some strategies that we use to take care of ourselves? I'll offer some ideas. Looking at numbers, how many people die by suicide in Canada each year? So in 2012, 39,026 died by suicide. Of that, 2,972 were males, 954 were females. Not sure about the stats of the LGBTQ community, so that's an important element. Suicide rate overall was 11.3 per 1,000 and 17.3 per 100,000 for males, 5.4 per 100,000 for females. So males typically are more likely to be able to commit suicide. The ratio goes from 3 to 1, and in the United States it's 4 to 1. And typically that's because males use more violent ways of ending their life. And in the States, I'm guessing, and that's what some of the research is telling us, is that it's because of the access to guns. Male suicide is 3 times higher than females since the 1950s, and the overall suicide rate with the general population is 11.3% per 100,000, so from the 10 to 90 area. During the working years, 20 to 64-ish, the general population of suicide rate, it increases to 14.3. So why is that important? Let's look at the context to paramedics, say. So in April 2014 to 2015, you had 35 paramedic suicides in Canada. We have an estimated 30,000, so the quota, the portion of percentage, if you will, would be 116.7 per 100,000. To me, that's an epidemic, and you know, that compared to 14.3% of the general population in this age group. So we've got a problem, and I'm going to share some ideas around what to do, a little bit more information about suicide, but I really invite people to think about what are they doing to help themselves. Right now, a lot of people talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, and I have a lot of people at Orange where I work, and I do some consulting here and there, and people, it's kind of like they're waiting to get bitten by the walking dead. They're waiting to get bitten by this thing called PTSD rather than being proactive. And so I want to talk a lot about being proactive. So again, first responders, 23 first responders and 5 military members died by suicide. 2015, 40 first responders, 12 military members have died. Between April 29th and December 31st, 2014, 27 first responders died by suicide and 19 by suicide for military. Those numbers are astounding. So let's look at how suicide and PTSD correlate or connect. PTSD raises a sufferer's suicide risk, but even less severe injuries can contribute, so that's an important element. It can be the icing on the cake. We call it kindling. It's a whole bunch of different things going on, and suddenly a person has a bunch of different difficult calls, and there it is. So personal anxiety, poor health, and family problems. I can't tell you how many first responders that I work with who say, yeah, I used to be in good shape. I used to take care of myself. And just a real invitation for us to start to look at that and think about it. We know suicide, there's a huge correlation with depression, how well we feel about ourselves, etc. And so that's an important piece. We also have to look at how are we taking care of ourselves, how are we having fun. Lots of people say, you know, give her to your liver, let's go for a drink. And I'm a big fan of, you know, you can go for a drink, but it's a drink, it's not how you cope. And too often when it becomes that, therein lies the problem. So are we having fun? Are we socializing? Is it something that's social, or is it something we're doing alone and engaged in as a way of living in our bodies because we can't otherwise? So withdrawal often happens where people start to isolate. They don't connect with people, etc. Or you can have withdrawal from alcohol and other drugs. Compassion fatigue and burnout, which often looks like depression. Compassion fatigue is what makes people susceptible to PTSD and vicarious trauma. So it's such an important piece because if there's so many first responders who are sort of, there's a lot of anger towards the system that they work in, and what I'm finding is that leads quite quickly to compassion fatigue. But if all you're doing is sitting and talking and grumping about an organization that you're working with, oftentimes that can leave us way more open to compassion fatigue. So some of the things that I say to some of the people that I've worked with is, if you're going to grump, have a time allotment for grumping, and then leave it alone and get on with your life. If you spend 12 hours a day, if that's what you work, grumping, there's going to be no happiness whatsoever at work. So just some things to think about. What I find happens with a lot of people who work as first responders is when exposed to repetitive crisis, our arousal cycle begins to rise. We can become hypo-aroused, and it can become a constant state. And this influences both positively and negatively how we deal with conflict. So if you look at it, you have your allostasis, so you're normal. You have a crisis, you come down, you go up, you come down. And over time, before too long, you have your new allostasis. It can be hyper, anxiety attacks, flashbacks, compulsive coping behaviors, anger, frustration, etc., or it can be hypo, disassociation, compulsive coping behaviors, self-injury, suicidal ideation, ... And so what's interesting is when people are often at the base and they're calm or comfortable, or they're at home and they're supposed to be doing family, normal, you know, mundane things that should be enjoyable, the normal is hard for them to live with. It's hard for them to understand how to be here, and they'll often find a problem in order to have a crisis because they're used to dealing with crisis. From a personal perspective, an example of that is that I often share is, you know, I'm driving in the car one day. I've lived in a crack house most of my life and was a professional boxer and and so I'm used to chaos and not the healthiest relationships. I'm driving with my then girlfriend, now partner, wife of 24 years, and I'm supposed to be down here and life is good. She's an introvert, so I ask her the question, everything okay? She's like, yeah, I'm good. I ask again, she tells me 10 seconds later. As I understand it, I thought it was 10 minutes later. She said 10 seconds. She says, I'm okay, are you okay? Woo-woo kind of thing. The next time I ask her, we're in a fight and I'm okay. Because I can do that dance. One of the problems with medics, first responders, police, fire, is unless there's chaos, it's hard to feel okay and comfortable. And so it's helping us to understand how do we recalibrate our nervous system when we get home. How do we recalibrate our nervous system so that we don't bring our crap into our houses? That's a really important element, and that's also why there's been such high divorce rates, etc., in this field. So some things to think about around that. PTSD, 2012 study noted that PTSD rate for emergency workers is very high. So for medics, it can be estimated around 16 to 24, and I've had estimations of anywhere from 10 to 19 for fire and for police. And so that's an important element. This is compared to about 9.3% for the average population or the general population. So some things to think about. Prevention. How do we prevent situations? By looking at both risk and resiliency factors. So as first responders looking around at our colleagues, how do we do some prevention? Where are resiliency factors? But also when looking at ourselves, what are we doing to take care of ourselves? And making sure that we're being intentional. PTSD, again, is a possibility, not an inevitability. But it can be if we don't do something about it. So how do we make sure we come forward? Intervention. So if you have someone who is thinking about suicide or you're worried about, suicide intervention is very different from counseling or simple listening. It's very direct or more active, that you have to listen, but also you want to get to the point and be specific. You want to know what their plans are. You want to know what's going on for them. And too often we don't ask the question, and we'll talk more about that in a bit, but asking the question is a really important component of this, i.e., are you planning on committing suicide? And sorry, I shouldn't say committing, that's not the right word, my apologies, are you suicidal at this moment? So post-vention refers to services offered to support and assist those affected. So after this happens, one of the hardest things for people is the grief, the loss. That's a huge part of it. But if the person lived through the suicide, it's also a really important element. How are we going to treat this person when they come back to work? How are we going to talk to them about it? How are we going to work with them? And so one of the things that I often talk about is as soon as someone comes back to work and they've either committed or I've had to work with them to talk them out of it, the post-vention is, how do we talk about this going forward? What would you like? I ask the question. How would you like me to address you when this stuff happens, when I'm worried or concerned? And so that we have a pathway to know how to talk about their suicidal ideation. Suicide prevention is a really important piece. And then we have the post-vention. Post-vention is a form of suicide prevention. And the goals of suicide post-vention, they're basically assisting those affected by suicide, the family members, the staff, the people around you. There's supporting those who need specialized support, so maybe the partners of the people, who's worked with them the closest, and again, family members. Providing appropriate and accurate information about suicide, and mitigating the effects of suicide contagion. It's incredible how much suicide contagion can, it's almost like giving a permission for someone to follow through with this stuff. So being able to work around that and mitigate this whole thought virus that this is a better way out, or this is actually the best option for me. So let's working to mitigate that. Facilitating the return to work. How does that happen? It's so important that when a person has struggled with a suicide attempt or sort of either had suicidal ideation and then had to take some time off work, how do we talk to those people when they come back to work? What do they want? What are their expectations? So that we can not just sort of avoid and make it uncomfortable for everybody. So from a prevention perspective, I'm wondering if, I'm asking everyone to think about this just for a second. When bad things happen, what are you doing to mitigate PTSD? What do you do for yourself to mitigate PTSD, right? Do you have a list of things that you as a go-to place? That's a really important component. So I'm really inviting people to think about that. And when's the last time you intentionally put on your Teflon, when going into a bad call in order to mitigate PTSD? So an example of when bad things happen, what are you doing? I remember after the crash happened at Orange, and I had to deal with a lot of things with staff, with family members, with grief, with loss. And I came home and I looked at my daughter and I was just being a bad dad, and she said to me at one point, since you've gone to Orange, you're not a very nice person. So it was like, holy crap, I'm not practicing what I preach. So every day when I get home, I take 10 minutes before going in the house, and I surf. I either talk to myself, I do a check-in, I do some sensory grounding. So what do I see, what do I hear, what do I feel? Make sure that I'm present and in the moment. And sometimes I'll do tapping. I'll talk about that in a minute in order to take care of myself. What do you do? I have a heavy bag in the house, and I have a heavy bag at Orange. I used to box professionally, so I can beat the crap out of that, so staying active is really important. So those are some important elements. The tying into trauma, I'm just inviting people to make sure that they stay out of people's shoes. How many of you hear or talk to people and they say, you have to walk in everyone's shoes? I say stay out of people's shoes. Know about their shoes, like their shoes, understand their shoes, treat them well, but if you're really uncomfortable, somewhere in there you slipped into their shoes. And you work with a lot of people who are highly distressed, and if you walk in everybody's shoes, you're going to burn out, develop compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma fairly quickly, and because it screws with your nervous system. So being able to breathe, step away, try to be more objective, and just acknowledge, I got to get out of these people's shoes right now. I got to be more present to what's happening. So that's an important piece, and I wish I had more time to talk about that. So the last piece before we move into some of the suicide stuff, more of the suicide stuff, is types of trauma. There's developmental shock and relational trauma. And what I invite everyone to look at is what might you have struggled with, or do you struggle with in your life? So if it's developmental trauma, where you grew up in adverse conditions that affect the nervous system, i.e. a child who's living in ambient chaos, there's lots of fighting, yelling, or nothing, i.e. neglect. It can really impact people, and when they're going into difficult calls where there might have been some trauma, i.e. developmental trauma that's occurring, child abuse, domestic violence, et cetera, it can really trigger the police that I see and I have worked with, my medics at Orange as well as fire. So what are you doing to take care of yourself when you're going into those difficult calls? Shock trauma is your work. It's events that are sudden and extreme that happen to people. So as you're coming into those calls, what are you doing to put on your Teflon? What are you doing to make sure that you're talking to yourself and making sure that you're as positive as you can be about this really shitty thing? So really important. And then relational trauma is what we do to each other. And so if you're coming into a situation where relational trauma was part of a bad call and a result of an injury, something that you have to fix as an officer, or you're getting there first as fire and you see some pretty horrific things, et cetera, et cetera. What do you do to take care of yourself and prepare yourself mentally before you get there? Lots of times we just get there, and then it's like, holy. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about surfing. Make sure that we're intentional. You know, we'll always have to ride waves. There's always going to be waves, but what do we do with them? So talk to yourself, don't listen. The greatest source of unhappiness is listening to yourself versus talking. So developing self-talk strategies and some rituals. My ritual, I sit in my car before coming into the house. I do some self-talk. I might do some journaling. I might do tapping. I'll talk about that in a sec. Psychological first aid. Do we talk to our colleagues on the way back from a difficult call? Do we talk to them before going into a call? How are we doing today? What's going on today for us? Are we as grounded as we could be going in? And I know that sounds social worky, cheesy, but it's really important. The work you guys and gals do is extraordinarily tough. Do you escape physically or mentally? Periodically. You can do that in your head. You can do that in your life. Do you get enough holidays? And when you're on holidays, do you think about this stuff, or are you able to get away from it? When you're in a situation that's really difficult, one of the things that they call it sensory grounding is just looking around the room and making sure that you know that you're okay and everything's good. What are 3 things you see, feel, and hear? And that way you can sort of ground yourself and be more objective and present, especially if your brain goes for a crap when there's a high energy situation. Remember what sustains you, what you love about the work you do. We often forget that when we're not in a good place. And move. Make sure you're moving. EFT is a emotional freedom therapy. It looks hokey as hell, and probably for a lot of people is, but it's something you can do for yourself. There's you can get on the web and it can take you from being a 10 out of 10 on feeling really crappy to a 2 or a 3 within moments. So it's a really nice way of coping. So know your resources, know what you can do and what you can't do, and remember it's possible to care too much. So, you know, I see a lot of people who, when they stop caring, they become defended, and they've started to leave the building, if you will. It makes them much more susceptible to compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, etc. What is compassion fatigue? It's transformation of the inner helper's experience. It's a cumulative effect of working with traumatized people, and there's general changes, withdrawal, despair, disconnection, cynicism that can come with it. I probably just named a lot of people that I work with sometimes and that I see. So I just invite you, if you're looking at this and saying check, 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 cautious, right? And so again, what are you going to do about this? Some of these symptoms are difficult. They're sleep problems, GI tract problems, neck and backache, anxiety, irritable, hypersensitivity, emotional numbness, hopelessness, powerlessness, overwhelmed, sadness, and depression. It's incredible the impacts this stuff can have on people. And so I know, excuse my language, but I know that when my shit can gets too high, I need to do all the stuff that I'm talking about, but that's when I also have to reach out for help. So really important element. So poor concentration, confusion, memory problems, difficulty making decisions, decreased self-esteem, spiritual relational issues, you have loss of meaning, sense of disconnection, interpersonal problems, and conflict. This reeks of suicidal ideation in many respects, especially the spiritual and relational. So how do you know there's some problems? When you have aggressiveness and irritability. You're seeing that in yourself and it's a significant change, or you're seeing it in others. When someone's giving things away and talking like, you know, it's been nice to know you, when they're in theory not going anywhere, feeling worthless, they're losing their confidence at the job they can do, with their relationships with human beings. Dramatic changes in mood and behavior. So, and remember, it's important that drama is a really important part of that. It's dramatic. Feeling trapped. The hardest thing about drama, though, is that sometimes if you have someone who's more introverted, you have to really know them well in order to know whether it's dramatic or not, because they're quiet all the time. So that's a tough one. So it's knowing all the other signs as well. Feeling trapped, like it's the only thing that you have in the world. With a lot of medics that I work with, because that's the most, I always invite them to start looking at a plan B. What else is there in their life if it comes to the point where they can't do this anymore? And it's not like I'm trying to get rid of people, but it's really important that people have an exit plan so they don't feel that trapped. Frequently talking about death, really, and again, looking for shifts. A sense of hopelessness, no hope in the future, engaging in risky behaviors that are not usual for them. So possessing lethal means, they can finish the job off if they want to. Feeling like they don't belong, that they're not connected, and whereas they used to feel very connected. Social isolation, and a lot of times people start to isolate themselves. They start to withdraw themselves. Feeling like a burden to others, a history of suicidal behavior, either familial, other people, or they themselves have a history of it personally. And alcohol and drug abuse or misuse. So those are some important components. Can I just invite people to think about this stuff? I can understand suicidal thoughts and plans can be how someone's coping. That's an important element. That when that's all a person has to focus on in order to live in their body, that can be highly problematic. But that if that's their only go-to, it actually can keep people on the planet for a while, but we have to catch it. I can empathize with a person considering suicide, that for them it's a possible solution, and I'm afraid of how I might feel or what might happen if someone I know dies by suicide. So I just invite people to think about this because it makes it easy for you to either come out and talk about this stuff, or it can make it more difficult depending on how you see these things. And so it can make it more difficult for you to talk about it with someone, but it also can make it more difficult for your partner to come and talk to you about it if you have a lot of judgment around it. So checking ourselves on that. How open are we to having difficult, clear conversations with people? Some myths. People who talk about suicide rarely do it. Not true. And in fact, sometimes they're desensitizing each and every time. A suicidal person wants to die, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. If that was true, there'd be a lot more people that I've worked with not on the planet. And so I feel blessed to be able to have been the person that people can come to talk to about it. And I also feel blessed that someone once told me, ask the question. If you're wondering about it, ask the question, are you feeling suicidal? So that's a really important element. A person who has committed suicide will always have thoughts of suicide. Not necessarily. And although it's something that is possible, but it's not always something that they want to carry with them. So I always have conversation with people around, you know, how do you want to talk about this going forward? If you ask a person directly about suicide, it will lead to a suicide attempt. The important part there is that I can't tell you how many people have been so felt so pleased that someone actually asked them the question, and they then could talk about it, because they had been, the big word is perseverating on it for a long time and struggling with what to do with it. A good job, stable relationships prevent people from contemplating suicide. Not true. It's something that a lot of people think, you know, they had everything, so why would they do this? There's lots of reasons for it. Some of those reasons are what we talked about a little bit before, and I wish I could go in a little bit longer, getting on with the day. Look for an invitation and warning signs. So make sure that you're looking for that when you're working with someone. If anyone's using any of those symptoms of they're aggressive, they're angry, they're talking about what past tense about, you know, or when I'm gone, build rapport and approach. I often, if I'm going to be working with someone for a long time, I ask them, how do you want to deal with conflict, and how do you want to deal with if there's ever any tough questions that I have to ask you? So being able to build that into an agreement with how you work together is a really important piece. Ask the question if you think it's going to if you think something's going on. Listen and understand. Don't try to fix it. In fact, let them, you know, ask them about reasons for living. Ask them about reasons that they should still be on the planet. And oftentimes when they start talking about it, they can start to see all the things that are present to them that they couldn't see because they're in depression or PTSD or. Assess severity of risk, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10. Check in with people and develop a safety plan, or support them to develop a safety plan if you're able to do that. So these are some of the intervention steps that are really important. And then follow up, and again, contract how you want to talk about this next time instead of just leaving it and never talking about it again, because that can get really awkward. So, so here's a chart that I think might be helpful for people in just knowing. It's fairly self-explanatory, and with the minutes that I have left, I'm not going to go too much into it, but it's a really important piece. So suicidal ideation and frequency, intensity, lethality, availability, and specificity of plan. So all of these are key elements, and looking at it from, you know, from occasional to continuous speaks to how you are going to move forward with letting someone else know and getting support for that person. So as we move towards the end of today, before the questions, you know, I invite people, are you going to do anything different going forward? What are you going to do for yourself as of today? Because that's what this is about. And also, is there anything that your organization can do to support you differently? And how are you going to ask for that, right? So, and I joke and say, no, really, do you need something? So the realists are all saying, yeah, whatever, but I'm half full, I'm half empty, I think this is piss. So I just thought I'd throw that in for some fun. Remember good self-care. It's okay to ask for help. When looking for a counselor, here's some questions. I need someone who's very experienced with trauma. I need someone who I don't have to take care of when I talk about trauma. and what I've seen and what I've been through, I don't have to take care of these people, and I need someone who's going to work with me rather than saying get a new job. So that's an important element for people to be aware of. So never give up, folks. Reach out, ask for support, please. Thank you so much.
Very powerful, Tom. Thanks so much for sharing your experience, your thoughts, your wisdom. Before we go into the question and answer period, Tom, I wondered, would you be willing to stay with us maybe for an extra 5–10 minutes, recognizing that we got delayed at the beginning with our technical issues?
100%. I'm good to go.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. So we've been receiving a lot of questions and comments, and I know that when you were showing the statistics, it was resonating with a lot of folks, as well as some were even suspecting that they're probably higher as well. And someone even shared, you know, that we think about the traumatic calls that we go based on the people that we serve, but sometimes the impact of the trauma can actually create more trauma in the workplace. So that was another comment that I felt like sharing.
Well, can I say something about that?
I'm sorry?
Can I say something about that? Just
yes,
really
of course. Please go ahead.
Well, trauma is how we make sense of it. And so when we start to share about the trauma, it can impact people more. But also when we overthink things and go over it in our head, it can become much more problematic because we're deepening the impact of that trauma. And so I'm not saying don't think about things, but I am saying if we go into every call thinking this might be the call, you know, if you're in a barbershop long enough, you're going to get a haircut, right? So it's so important that we take care of ourselves when we're going to difficult calls, but how we make sense of them, if we're just thinking this is going to F us up, it will, right? So how do we make sure we see this differently and we put our Teflon on and know that we're going to be okay as long as we talk it through, work it through, exercise, engage, live healthy, we can do a lot better. And if we need to go to therapy before it becomes a problem. Sorry.
No, that was well said. Thanks for adding that. Just a note to the participants, we recognize that the original time was slated to end at 2 Eastern Standard Time. So if you're leaving the webinars, please do take a moment to fill in the survey. As I mentioned earlier, it's very valuable input that helps us make sure that we improve on a continuous basis. So again, please fill out the survey. So Tom, one of the questions that we had was around self-assessments. So are there any tools out there that can help folks self-assess in terms of compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma? And if not, what would be some tips, I guess?
So one of the things, the first tips is some of those symptoms that I talked about can be really helpful. Secondly, there are different mental health checkups that you can do that are really important, checkup from the neck up, but they're for different elements. The other thing is the Crisis Trauma Resource Institute, they have a wellness package that is fabulous, and it has a sort of a quiz of what the symptomology is, and people can take a test and get a sense of where they are on that piece. They use that for first responders or people in the social services sector. That's the Crisis Trauma Resource Institute, and I'm not trying to sell that, but it's a really neat little tool that they have. There's and then the Canadian Traumatology Institute. I'm not sure how public it is though, or how accessible it is, but just sending them a little note, you could probably get some stuff. The other thing people could do is if anyone has any questions about how to access any of that stuff, they could drop me a quick email. I'm probably going to be sorry that I said that, but hey.
Well, your email is at the end of the slide, so I guess you provided an extra incentive now. I wonder, and we have a few mixed comments or questions that I'm trying to combine. So what would be some advice that you would give to someone that might be living through some of the things you mentioned today? Or conversely, if you're a colleague and have noticed some changes, or you've noticed that they're always down at the office, what would be some tangible steps that they can take?
One of the things that I would do is say, the piece for me is about transparency and being clear with people. So say Sam, let's pretend for a sec you're that person, and I'm coming to you and I'm your colleague. Is that cool?
Sounds good, yes.
So I'm the colleague, and I might say, can I take a few minutes of your time? I want to talk to you about something fairly serious. Is that okay? So I want Sam to put on his Teflon, okay? So he gets ready for this call or for this conversation, and I've also asked permission to do it so I don't just drop it on him or her, because then you're going to get defensiveness. So then I'm just going to say, you know, over the past few months, I've noticed that, you know, you've talked a little bit about you're not laughing as much. You're talking a little bit about feeling depressed and not having much to do. You're not engaging with us anymore. You stopped playing ball. You're not going to work out anymore. And I know it might sound a little creepy. I'm noticing all those things, but you're my work partner, and I'm a little worried about you. Is there anything I can do to help you? That's what I might do. Right? So Sam can get pissed off at me, or he can say, yeah, I'm having some struggles. What do I do? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Thanks so much for sharing that, Tom. So actually we have a few folks that really appreciated you sharing some statistics and the Alliosis diagram. Are you able to share the source of those?
Yeah,
Maybe
I can get that and by email, or they can drop me a note. The allostasis stuff, the diagram itself, I created that out of theory, and because my master's was on how to engage youth gangs, actually, into counseling using visuals. And so it's a way of compressing complexity. But I can send the theory.
Sounds good. And perhaps we have the time to answer one or two last questions. Someone wants to know what is the day in the life of a human factors specialist at Orange. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. It depends on what's happening. Oftentimes, if I come in and it's a blank slate, then I might talk to as many as 10 people about their issues, from family life to bad calls, etc. At night or sometimes in the mornings, very rarely, but I might get a call from OCC when there's been a difficult call. So afterwards, I call the medics on their way back from the call, or when they drop the person off at the hospital as they're going back to the base, I will talk to them. Typically before they get back to base, or just as they get back to base. Sometimes if it's a local call, I can go down to the base and work with them to debrief the call and to work around that stuff. I sometimes get calls when someone's not feeling very good or maybe suicidal. So that's one of my jobs. I've developed and implemented the peer support program, so it's a lot of training, motivational interviewing, mental health, almost every kind of issue that you can imagine. I guess 6, 7 different workshops on different issues that people might be facing. So I'm sort of a go-to person in the day in the life of a human factors specialist. It's the coolest job in Canada, but it's busy.
It sounds like you're in a wonderful position to be able to share the breadth of your experiences and also just help, to your point earlier, help those that dedicate their lives to helping others. One common question that we get, and we're seeing it here today from the participants, is around the whole claims process, I guess, and particularly if there's a compensation claim. So on one side, there's frustration, and I guess on the other side, there's also the mental health of the individual that might be going through the process. Any advice or, I guess, tips or experiences to share in terms of how you can navigate that, understanding that it can take a toll on the person's mental health, and at the same time, you still need to build that resilience to go through the process?
One of the things that I think is really important is so as we talk about presumptive legislation, getting a note from a doc is important. If there's mental health issues that accompany that, sometimes it can be problematic because we're not sure which is this PTSD or is this the person's mental health issue, and so for me it's going for the note, and if I'm not answering the question, Sam, let me know. But it's going for the note, making sure the doc's well informed about what's going on, but then it's seeking out trauma-informed people. So if it's EAP you're working with, it's the questions you ask that are so important when you're working with EAP in order to be able to get a good support to move forward. The other thing is a lot of people think that if you have PTSD, your career is screwed, or if you have a mental illness, your career is screwed. So as someone who theoretically, and TMI, sorry, too much information, but as someone who lives with depression, who lives with post-traumatic stress disorder, if that were true, I hear the worst of the worst, and so it's my job to take care of myself too. So know that going to a doc, making sure you get a good assessment, and then moving into not being told that you have to leave the work world, but getting good trauma care. The Canadian Traumatology Institute can help people find good therapists across this province, and there's other services, but that's the one that I do a lot of work for and with. And the Crisis Trauma Resource Institute can help, but they're more Winnipeg-based. So those are a couple of things I'd be really worked towards in terms of, but make sure you get a doc's note and someone who's worked with you for a while.
Thanks, Tom. No, I think that provides a good overview in terms of other things that can be done during the claims process. You touched a bit around statistics and the differences between men and women, and we know that traditionally, and it's certainly starting to change, but currently still there tends to be a lot more men than women in first responder type roles. Are there different types of signs or symptoms that folks should be looking out for? There's so much there. That's a PhD essay, I think. That said, with men, I think if you have someone who starts to talk about, so if you have an introvert versus an extrovert, you've got some issues. So the introverted person is going to get more morose. The extroverted person is going to be a lot more out there, okay, and more verbal about their anger towards the company. That's often what happens first. The introvert says some side comments, but they sort of disappear a lot more. So if you see either an escalation or a de-escalation and they're getting more introverted, women and men, I'd be aware of that.
what I find is women, they talk a lot more about not wanting to be around, or just how frustrating things are, that kind of thing. They're much, how do I say this? See, the thing with first responders that's so important about this is it's harder for women to talk about this stuff, and as men, we almost steal from women the gifts that they bring. The reason they don't commit suicide as much or are as successful with it is because they're able to talk about it. And what happens is we steal their voice from them, because you can't be don't be a girl, I hear people saying to other women, paramedics, police officers, fire. So it's so important that we're aware. So if a woman who's been talkative out there, you know, and vivacious and just being who they are, stop doing that, you've got some problems. So looking for complete changes. So what I find happens.
Yeah, it sounds like the common message, I guess, is that regardless of the gender, it's really about noticing changes in behaviors and attitudes. One question that we got, Tom, is around the return to work process. In your experience, are there tools, I guess, or resources that can help both the employee or the employer navigate that process and ensure that that the person is ready to return to work?
Yes. One of the things that I think is really important is the person who's returning to work is that they're doing counseling about returning to work. So that's one thing. And it's exploring for them the meaning of returning to work. Trauma is how we make sense of things. And so what might be more, I've seen with some people, they're excited about getting back to work and they don't care what anybody else thinks. They're good, right? But I've also seen people who are more traumatized about going back to work and being judged. So it's working with people around the skills and strategies for how they're going to deal with different comments, different off-the-cuff things, people treating them differently or treating them like they're less than or unable to, so that there's that piece with them. And then working with staff around how do we treat people coming back to work after a suicide attempt. And so having difficult conversations with people and some training around what's helpful, what's not helpful. And then having management have a conversation with someone around how do you want to talk about your return to work? Is this going to be a quiet, you're going to slip in and, you know, just hopefully get back to normal, or do you want to have a conversation with people before returning? Both are good, but they're musts in terms of staff knowing what to do, and the person who has from a post-vention perspective, the person who is coming back to work, there needs to be a pathway for them so that they can feel somewhat comfortable in this discomfort. Does that make sense for people?
It does. It sounds like, you know, another aspect to think about is how do you plan? So it's the aspect of planning ahead and visualizing almost how things will unfold, because there are so many different elements at play.
It's so complex.
So with that, Tom, I will pass it back to my colleague Carla, who I believe had a few words to thank. But from myself, anyways, thank you so much, Tom, for your sharing your time and expertise today. So I'll pass it over to you, Carla.
Thanks, Samuel.
Thanks so much.
Just on behalf of all of us at the Mental Health Commission, thanks to all our participants for joining us today. A special thank you to you, Tom, for your presentation, and to Samuel for hosting our session today. And thank you again to all of our partners from across the country that we mentioned at the introduction to this session. for your assistance in helping us to promote the webinar. We hope that many of you will join us again on October 4th for our next webinar in this series. We certainly look forward to hosting you then. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much to the Commission.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom.